Welcome to my channel, The World of Science Fiction. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Planet XR7. Planet XR7, barren and scorched by the radiation of twin suns, was the last place anyone expected to find life. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of ochre sand dunes that shimmered like molten copper under the merciless glare of the binary stars. The air itself seemed to waver, thick with heat and the acrid scent of mineral dust that collected in the lungs with each labored breath. Among these endless dunes and jagged obsidian rocks that jutted from the sand like the teeth of buried monsters, the cargo ship Alter 9 had crashed. Its once sleek hull was now a twisted mass of scorched metal, torn open like a sardine can and bleeding coolant fluid into the thirsty sand. The ship's emergency beacons blinked weakly, their signals fading into the vast emptiness of space, useless, unheard. On board were two survivors, human pilot Kyle Reed and his companion, the blue-skinned Ziri named Lanira. Their mission had been simple: deliver water supplies to a distant colony on the far side of the Nyx sector. A routine job, one of dozens Kyle had flown before. But now, as smoke billowed from the wreckage and the desert heat pressed down like a physical weight, their goal had narrowed to a single primal imperative: survival. Kyle lay sprawled across the cockpit floor, consciousness flickering like a faulty light. Through the haze of pain, he could make out the twisted remnants of the control panel above him, wires dangling like entrails. Every breath sent daggers of agony through his side, and when he touched the spot, his fingers came away slick with blood. Too much blood. "Lanira," he called, his voice a ragged whisper that scraped against his parched throat. He tried to sit up, but the movement sent a fresh wave of pain crashing through him, and he fell back with a groan. A shadow fell across his face, and he squinted up to see Lanira standing over him. Unlike humans, the Ziri had evolved on a world of perpetual twilight, and Lanira's large, pupilless eyes, solid orbs of deep violet, were perfectly adapted to the dim conditions of her home world. Here, under the brutal light of XR7's twin suns, she wore protective goggles that gave her an insect-like appearance. Her blue skin, normally the color of Earth's tropical oceans, had taken on a duller hue from the dust that clung to her. "Don't move," she said, her voice carrying the musical lilt characteristic of the Ziri language even when speaking standard. "You're badly hurt." Kyle watched as Lanira moved with feline grace through the wreckage, her lithe form ducking beneath fallen beams and stepping over debris. Her long, silky blue hair, a point of pride among the Ziri, was tied back in a practical braid that reached her waist. She was searching through the remains of the cargo hold, methodically checking compartments and containers. "Water supply?" Kyle asked, each word an effort. Lanira's expression, always difficult for humans to read due to the subtle differences in Ziri facial muscles, seemed to tighten. Destroyed. The impact ruptured the tanks. Everything soaked into the sand. Kyle closed his eyes, absorbing this new blow. Without water, their survival time on this hellscape of a planet could be measured in hours, not days. "Radio?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The communications array had been the first thing to go when they hit the atmosphere, torn away by the friction of entry. "Dead," Lanira confirmed, returning to his side with a small emergency kit. "And that's not our only problem." She nodded toward one of the shattered viewports, where Kyle could see dark shapes circling in the distance, winged silhouettes against the burning skyline. "Saran vultures," Lanira said grimly. "They can smell blood from kilometers away, and they have claws that can tear through metal." As if to emphasize her point, a screech echoed across the desert, a sound like grinding metal that sent a primal shiver down Kyle's spine. He tried again to sit up, and this time managed to prop himself against the fallen bulkhead, though the effort left him gasping. He felt the warm trickle of blood flowing faster from his side, and looking down, he saw that his flight suit was soaked with it, torn open to reveal a jagged gash about 20 centimeters long. "That needs closing," Lanira said, her tone clinical as she assessed the wound, "or you'll bleed out before the vultures even get here." She opened the emergency kit, but her expression fell as she examined the contents. Medical supplies are minimal. No sutures, no sealant. She looked up at Kyle, her alien eyes unreadable behind the goggles. "This is going to hurt." Before Kyle could respond, Lanira was moving again, slipping out through the tear in the hull into the blinding sunlight. Kyle leaned his head back against the metal, feeling the fever of blood loss beginning to set in. His thoughts wandered to Earth, to the small apartment in New Seattle where his sister would be waiting for his scheduled call, unaware that he was bleeding out on a desert planet thousands of light years away. Lanira returned moments later, clutching something in her hand, a thick spine from one of the rare Aryan cacti that somehow managed to survive in this wasteland. The spine was about 10 centimeters long and wickedly sharp at both ends. "Hold on, Kyle," Lanira shouted, seeing him begin to lose consciousness. Without needles or thread, she used the spine to pierce the edge of his wound, making Kyle cry out in pain. But what happened next surprised him, even through the haze of agony. Lanira reached up and, with a swift motion, cut a long strand of her silky blue hair using a shard of metal from the wreckage. The Ziri were known to be extremely protective of their hair. It held cultural and possibly even religious significance that Kyle had never fully understood. Working quickly, her dexterous fingers wove the blue strands into a strong thread. Then, clenching her teeth in concentration, she began stitching his wound closed using the improvised needle and thread. Kyle groaned in agony, his back arching as the makeshift needle pierced his flesh again and again. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and mingling with the dust to form muddy trails down his cheeks. With each stitch, he felt a strange tingling sensation radiating outward from the wound, not just pain, but something else, a foreign warmth that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his heartbeat. "Don't move, or I'll kill you before the vultures do," Lanira muttered, her voice tight with tension that belied her seemingly harsh words. Kyle could hear the fear beneath her gruff exterior, fear not just for herself, but for him as well. They had been flying together for 3 standard years now, and though their relationship had always been professional, there was an undeniable bond between them, the kind that forms between those who repeatedly entrust their lives to each other in the cold void of space. As Lanira tied off the final stitch, Kyle felt an intense burning sensation around the wound, not the expected pain of an injury, but something deeper, as if the alien hair were burrowing into his flesh, seeking connection with his very cells. The sensation was gone almost as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only a dull throb and the faintest itch beneath his skin. The smell of blood was already attracting predators outside. The screeching of the vultures grew louder, more frenzied. Through the tear in the hull, Kyle could see their massive forms now, each with a wingspan of at least 2 meters, their bodies covered not in feathers, but in scales that glinted like burnished copper in the sunlight. Their heads were eyeless, with sensory pits that could detect the heat of a living body or the chemical signature of blood from incredible distances. "Almost done," Lanira said, her voice steadier now as she tied off the last of the improvised sutures. "The good news is the bleeding has stopped. The bad news," she gestured toward the circling vultures, "we can't stay here." Kyle nodded weakly. The pain in his side had dulled to a throbbing ache, but he felt lightheaded and knew he had lost a dangerous amount of blood. "How long until nightfall?" he asked. "About 6 standard hours," Lanira replied, helping him to sit up straighter. "But we can't wait that long. Those creatures hunt day and night, and the smell of blood will only draw more of them. We need to find better shelter and, more importantly, water." Kyle knew she was right. Without water, any other plans were meaningless. They would die of dehydration long before starvation became an issue in this heat. With Lanira's help, Kyle managed to stand, leaning heavily against her. Though the Ziri appeared slender, Her species possessed surprising strength, and she supported his weight with relative ease. Together, they salvaged what they could from the wreckage. A plasma cutter that could serve as both tool and weapon, a portable scanner with limited functionality, and a thermal blanket that would provide crucial insulation during the desert night when temperatures plummeted below freezing. As they prepared to leave the relative safety of the wrecked ship, Kyle paused, looking at Lanira's shortened braid. "Your hair," he said softly. "I know what that means to your people. Thank you." Lanira's expression softened momentarily, but she quickly resumed her practical demeanor. "Save your thanks for when we're off this rock," she said, "and try not to bleed on me. I just cleaned this flight suit." The attempt at humor, weak as it was, raised Kyle's spirits slightly. With one last look at the ship that had been their home for countless journeys across the stars, they stepped out into the merciless desert of XR7, the vultures circling overhead like harbingers of doom. The twin suns beat down on them with savage intensity as they made their way across the dunes. Each step was an effort for Kyle, who could feel his wound pulling against the blue hair sutures with every movement. Lanira set a slow but steady pace, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon for threats or opportunities. "The scanner is picking up a geographic anomaly about 3 kilometers east," she said, studying the device in her hand. "Might be a rock formation we could use for shelter, potentially even a cave system." Kyle nodded, not trusting himself to speak. His mouth was already dry as paper, his tongue feeling swollen and alien. In the distance, the vultures continued to follow, patient in their pursuit, knowing that sooner or later the wounded prey would falter. What neither of them realized was that the blue hair stitched into Kyle's flesh was already beginning to work its influence on him in ways that would forever alter both their destinies. The night on XR7 was as brutal in its cold as the day had been in its heat. Kyle and Lanira had made it to the rock formation, a jumble of massive boulders that offered some protection from the wind that howled across the desert, carrying stinging particles of sand that abraded any exposed skin. Throughout the night, Kyle's sleep had been fitful, interrupted by waves of intense sensation. His skin crawled with an incessant, maddening itch that no amount of scratching could satisfy. His bones ached as if they were being compressed and reshaped from within. His muscles spasmed randomly, sometimes so violently that he jerked awake with a cry. Each time, Lanira had soothed him back to sleep with soft words in her native tongue, but the discomfort persisted. Kyle woke to a strange sensation, or rather a constellation of sensations. His body felt different, lighter yet stronger, and the pain in his side had diminished to a dull ache. The skin across his torso felt tight, as if it had shrunk overnight, and an intense burning sensation radiated outward from his wound. But the physical changes paled in comparison to the sensory onslaught. The darkness of their shelter, which had been nearly absolute when he'd fallen asleep, now seemed filled with subtle gradations of light. He could distinguish the individual grains of sand on the rock wall opposite him, count the number of cracks in a stone that should have been invisible in the dim light. His hearing had sharpened to an almost painful degree. He could detect the faint scuttle of insectoid creatures moving through sand dozens of meters away, the whisper of Lanira's breath, even the subtle rush of blood through his own veins. Most disorienting of all, he could sense emotions not his own, but a swirling mixture of concern, determination, and a deep resonant fear that somehow he knew belonged to Lanira. The alien feelings invaded his consciousness like radio signals breaking through static, unclear but unmistakably present. Disoriented by the sensory overload, Kyle raised his hands to rub his eyes and froze. In the pale light of XR7's 3 moons filtering through cracks in their shelter, he could see that his skin was covered in fine blue hairs, almost fur-like in texture. The fur was spreading outward from the wound in his side like a living tattoo, growing visibly as he washed, each new hair emerging with a pinprick sensation that was both painful and oddly satisfying, like the relief of a long-delayed sneeze. Lanira was keeping watch at the entrance to their small shelter, her back to him, unaware of his awakening. Kyle felt a surge of panic rise in his throat. "What did you do to me?" he demanded, his voice cracking with fear, the sound painfully loud in his hypersensitive ears. Lanira spun around, her hand automatically reaching for the plasma cutter. When she saw Kyle, really saw him, illuminated by the moonlight that filtered through a crack in the rocks, she stepped back, shock evident even in her alien features. "This is impossible," she whispered, moving closer to examine him. Kyle could feel her astonishment and confusion through this strange new connection, emotions washing over him like waves, making his head throb with their intensity. "Your hair," Kyle said, understanding dawning as another wave of transformation rippled through him. His jaw ached as if his teeth were being reset in his gums. His fingertips tingled, the nails hardening and slightly elongating. "The sutures. What's happening to me?" Kyle doubled over as a particularly intense spasm racked his body. It felt as if his internal organs were rearranging themselves, shifting into new configurations. The burning sensation that had started at his wound now engulfed his entire body. Not painful exactly, but overwhelming, like being submerged in water just on the edge of too hot. Lanira knelt beside him, reaching out a tentative hand to touch the blue fur that now covered much of his torso and was spreading slowly up his neck and down his arms. Her touch sent a shock of sensation through him. His skin had become hypersensitive, each follicle of new fur acting like a tiny antenna, picking up tactile information with excruciating precision. "There are ancient legends among my people," she said softly. Her voice sounded different to Kyle's transformed ears, richer, more complex, with harmonics and subtleties he'd never detected before. He could hear the subtle clicks and cheers that were part of the Ziri language, but usually inaudible to humans. "The Ziri hair carries our essence, our genetic material, our emotions, our souls for lack of a better word, but it has never transferred to another species before." She looked up at the crack in the rock ceiling through which the stars were visible. The radiation from the twin suns, combined with the unique chemical composition of XR7's atmosphere, it must have altered the process somehow. Kyle tried to process this information, but he was distracted by the foreign emotions in his head. Lanira's emotions, he now realized, and the continued cascade of sensory information flooding his consciousness. Colors seemed more vivid, with spectrums extending beyond what he'd previously been able to perceive. He could see ultraviolet patterns on Lanira's skin, markings invisible to human eyes that swirled like luminescent tattoos across her blue flesh. The air itself seemed alive with particles, currents, and subtle electromagnetic fluctuations. "I can feel what you're feeling," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, his new vocal cords producing tones that resonated strangely in his transformed ear canals. "It's overwhelming, and I can see everything." He squeezed his eyes shut, but even the darkness behind his eyelids was filled with neural afterimages and phantom lights. Lanira's eyes widened behind her goggles. "You can sense my emotions. That's a Ziri trait. We are mildly empathic with each other, but never with other species." Before Kyle could respond, a high-pitched screech cut through the night air. Lanira's head snapped toward the entrance of their shelter. "They're coming," she said, grabbing the plasma cutter and moving to the entrance. "The vultures hunt at night too." Kyle stood, surprised at how steady he felt despite his wound and the strange transformation overtaking his body. He could sense Lanira's shift from shock to focus, determination, and somehow it steadied him as well. "We have to move," Lanira said, noticing the shadows of vultures on the horizon, silhouetted against the largest of XR7's moons. "This shelter is too exposed." Kyle nodded, gathering their meager supplies. "Which way?" Lanira consulted the scanner. "The formation continues eastward, getting more complex. There might be deeper caves, more protection." They slipped out of their temporary shelter into the cold desert night. The temperature had plummeted to near freezing, but Kyle found that his new blue fur provided unexpected insulation. His skin, now entirely covered in fine blue hairs, no longer registered the cold as discomfort, but rather as information. Just another data point in the vast sensory landscape he now inhabited. The desert night, which should have been nearly pitch black to human eyes, appeared to Kyle in startling clarity. His transformed vision parsed the darkness into layers of information. Heat signatures from rocks still radiating the day's warmth, the faint bioluminescence of nocturnal desert life, the UV reflections from mineral deposits in the sand. The moons cast 3 different colored glows across the landscape, one silver, one pale blue, and one with a reddish tint, creating an alien tableau of multiple overlapping shadows that Kyle could distinguish with perfect clarity. His hearing, too, had transformed. The desert, far from silent, was alive with sound. The subtle shift of sand grains in the breeze, the distant movements of predators and prey, even the faint electrical hum of Lanira's scanner. His brain, still partly human, struggled to process this overwhelming influx of sensory data, creating moments of disorienting synesthesia where sounds had colors and textures had tastes. They hadn't gone more than half a kilometer when the wind began to pick up. At first it was just a stronger version of the constant breeze, but within minutes it had become a howling gale that whipped sand into their faces with stinging force. "Sandstorm," Lanira shouted over the wind, her voice nearly lost in the roar. "We need to find cover now." But the storm engulfed them like a living beast, a wall of sand that reduced visibility to mere centimeters. The air itself became a solid thing, filled with particles that threatened to scour the flesh from their bones. Kyle felt Lanira's hand grasp his, her fingers intertwining with his to maintain contact in the blinding maelstrom. Despite the chaotic conditions, Kyle realized he could still sense the vultures through the storm. His newfound sensitivity, perhaps an extension of the Ziri empathic abilities, allowed him to feel their predatory hunger, their single-minded focus on the wounded prey they had been stalking. "They're close," he shouted, squeezing Lanira's hand and pulling her in a different direction than they had been heading. "I can feel them." Lanira didn't question him, following his lead through the swirling sand. The storm was actually a blessing in disguise, masking their scent and making it harder for the vultures to track them precisely. But it also disoriented them, making it impossible to follow the scanner directions to deeper shelter. Suddenly, a dark shape lunged through the curtain of sand. One of the vultures had found them despite the storm, its sensory pits detecting their body heat. The creature was even more terrifying up close, its wingspan at least 2 meters, its maw a circular opening ringed with teeth that rotated like a drill when it fed. Where eyes would be on an earth bird, this predator had only smooth, scaled skin with heat-sensing pits that glowed with an eerie reddish light. Instinctively, Kyle pushed Lanira aside and grabbed a sharp shard of metal from the ground, a piece of their ship that had been carried here by the storm. As the vulture lunged again, Kyle countered the attack, driving the improvised weapon deep into the creature's sensory pit. The vulture emitted a screech that made both Kyle and Lanira cover their ears, and then it fell, writhing, to the sand. But the victory was fleeting. Through the swirling dust, more shapes were becoming visible, the rest of the pack, drawn by their wounded companion's distress call. "We can't kill them all," Lanira yelled, pointing to a dark shadow in the side of a dune. "We need shelter." They spotted a narrow crevice in the rocks and dashed inside, the vulture's screeches echoing behind them. The space was cramped, barely wide enough for them to squeeze through sideways, but it offered protection from both the storm and their pursuers. They pushed deeper into the crevice until it widened slightly, forming a small chamber where they could at least sit side by side. Kyle panted heavily, his body trembling not from fear, but from the strange sensations coursing through him. The blue fur had now spread to cover most of his body, and he could feel his senses sharpening even further. The darkness of the cave was no longer impenetrable. He could make out details that should have been invisible to human eyes. Lanira watched him with concern, her emotions a complex tapestry that Kyle could read with increasing clarity. Worry for him, scientific fascination, and beneath it all, a deep-seated guilt. "You saved my life," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling of the storm outside. "But what's happening to you?" Kyle looked down at his hands, now completely covered in fine blue hair. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can feel you, your emotions, your fears. It's terrifying, but also," he struggled to find the words, "it's like I'm not alone in my own head anymore." Lanira reached out and squeezed his hand, her blue skin now almost matching his own. "We'll get through this," she said firmly. "Together." Outside, the storm continued to rage, and the vultures circled, waiting for their prey to emerge. But within the small cave, a different kind of connection was forming, one that transcended species and would reshape both their destinies in ways neither could yet imagine. As the storm abated with the coming dawn, exhaustion finally claimed them both. They slept fitfully, taking turns keeping watch, though Kyle found that even in sleep, some part of his newly enhanced consciousness remained alert to danger. When full daylight returned, bringing with it the scorching heat of the twin suns, they ventured out of their shelter. The landscape had been transformed by the storm. Dunes shifted and reshaped, creating an entirely new topography. The vultures were gone, at least temporarily, perhaps having found easier prey during the night. Kyle's transformation had continued during the brief hours of rest. His skin was now entirely covered in the blue fur, and his senses had sharpened to an almost painful degree. He could smell water, a hint of moisture far below the sand, unreachable but tantalizing. His vision could pick out details at distances that would have required binoculars before, and the empathic connection to Lanira had strengthened, making her emotions as clear to him as his own. They had been walking for perhaps an hour, following the scanner directions toward what might be a more permanent source of shelter, when Kyle froze, his heightened senses detecting something that made his newly grown fur stand on end. "Blood," he whispered, the metallic scent unmistakable even in the dry air. "Human blood." Lanira immediately crouched behind a rock, plasma cutter at the ready. "Which direction?" Kyle closed his eyes, focusing his enhanced senses. The smell came from beyond the next ridge, along with something else, fear, pain, and a malevolent satisfaction that made his stomach turn over. "There," he pointed, "and I sense people, humans, at least 5 of them." Cautiously, they crept forward to the edge of the ridge. What they saw below made even Lanira, hardened by years of frontier space travel, inhale sharply. A makeshift camp sprawled in a natural depression between dunes, sheltered from the worst of the winds. But this was no ordinary survivor's refuge. The centerpiece was a collection of trophies arranged in a macabre display. Flight suits hung like flags, each bearing the insignia of different ships and corporations. Some were stained dark with what could only be blood. Personal effects, watches, jewelry, identification tags, were strung together in grotesque wind chimes that tinkled in the desert breeze. Worse were the cages, crude but effective prisons fashioned from salvaged ship parts. 2 contained huddled figures, so thin and broken they barely looked human anymore. The 3rd cage held something non-human, perhaps a Korgian trader, its normally iridescent scales dulled by dehydration and abuse. "Marauders," Lanira hissed, her voice tight with disgust. "The worst kind of scavengers. They don't just take possessions. They take people, either for ransom, slavery, or—" She didn't need to finish the thought. Kyle could sense the captive's misery even from this distance, their hopelessness washing over him in waves that made his chest ache. "We need to help them." "We can't," Lanira said firmly, though he could feel how much it cost her to say it. "There are too many, and we're already weakened. We should go around, avoid." Her words cut off as a sound like metal striking metal rang out below. A tall human was beating a rod against a makeshift gong fashioned from a ship's hull plate. At the signal, figures emerged from the shelters. Not 5 as Kyle had initially sensed, but 8 humans dressed in mismatched survival gear. heavily armed with crude but effective weapons cobbled together from crash debris. "They're returning from a hunt," Lanira whispered. "We need to move now." But as they turned to retreat, Kyle's foot dislodged a loose stone. It wasn't large, but in the eerie quiet of the desert, its tumble down the ridge sounded like an avalanche. 8 heads snapped up in unison, 8 pairs of eyes scanning the ridge where Kyle and Lanira crouched. There was nowhere to hide, no time to run. "Well, well," called a gravelly voice from below. "Looks like today's haul just got better. Come down and join us, or we'll come up and fetch you." Kyle and Lanira exchanged glances. There was no choice but to comply for now. Slowly, they descended into the camp, hands raised to show they weren't immediately threatening. The marauders surrounded them, a circle of predatory grins and hungry eyes. The leader stepped forward, a tall, muscular man with skin burned nearly black by the desert suns, and a network of scars across his face that spoke of many battles survived. A particularly vicious scar ran from his forehead to his jaw, pulling one eye into a permanent squint. He carried a crossbow-like weapon that fired metal bolts with enough force to penetrate ship hulls. Around his neck hung a grotesque necklace, made of what appeared to be artificial eyes from various species encounter suits. "Well, well," he said, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed to scrape against the air itself. "What do we have here?" "Azuri, far from home." "And what the hell are you?" His eyes narrowed as he studied Kyle's transformed appearance, a gleam of avarice lighting his gaze. "We're just trying to survive," Kyle said, keeping his hands visible and non-threatening. "Our ship crashed yesterday." "Survival," the leader mused, stepping closer to examine Kyle's blue-furred skin. "That's what we're all doing here, isn't it? I'm Vex. This is my territory now." Kyle sensed the name psychically confirmed from the thoughts of the other marauders, along with an undercurrent of fear. Vex wasn't just their leader, he was their terror, the force that kept them in line through calculated brutality. "Interesting what this planet can do to a person," Vex continued, circling them slowly. "Been here 6 years myself. Crash-landed with a crew of 15 scientific researchers." He gestured to his band of killers. "These are what's left. The rest couldn't adapt." One of the marauders, a woman with a missing ear and a dead-eyed stare, laughed hollowly. "Adapt or die. That's the rule of XR7. Your ship," Kyle ventured, trying to establish some connection. "The Helios, a research vessel. I remember hearing about its disappearance." Vex's expression flickered with surprise. "Good memory. We were supposed to study the mineral composition of the twin suns." His laugh was bitter. "Now we study how long people last without water, or how many days different species can survive in the cages." He gestured to the prisoners. "Nothing personal, just business. The strong eat the weak. That's the only truth that matters out here." "It doesn't have to be that way," Kyle said. "We could work together, signal for rescue." Vex's face hardened. "Rescue?" He spat. "You think we haven't tried? This planet has some kind of electromagnetic disruption field. Long-range communications don't work. The only way off is on a ship with a functioning drive." His eyes gleamed with a mixture of madness and cunning, like the one you probably crashed in. "Our ship is destroyed," Lanira interjected. "There's nothing salvageable." Vex studied her, then returned his attention to Kyle. "What kind of freak are you, anyway?" He sneered, reaching out to touch the blue fur on Kyle's arm. "Never seen anything like this before. The collector on Rishka would pay well for such a specimen. Enough to finally get us off this rock." Kyle felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. The collector was likely a black market dealer in exotic beings, a slaver who specialized in rare species for private zoos or worse. "We were scientists once," Vex said, his voice dropping. For a moment, Kyle glimpsed the man he might have been, educated, purposeful, sane. But then the mask of cruelty slammed back into place. "Now we're survivors, and survival means making hard choices." Kyle realized with a flash of insight that Vex and his crew weren't just enemies. They were twisted reflections of what he and Lanira might become if they remained on XR7 too long. The planet didn't just kill. It corrupted, stripping away civilization layer by layer until only the animal remained. "You don't have to do this," Kyle said quietly. "You're still human. You can still choose." Something dangerous flashed in Vex's eyes. "I chose to live," he hissed. "And right now, you're worth more to me in a cage than walking free." They were trapped. The Marauders had them completely surrounded, weapons trained on them from all sides. Kyle could sense Lanira's racing thoughts as she calculated odds and possibilities, looking for a way out. Without warning, Vex struck Lanira with his crossbow stock, a vicious blow to the side of her head that sent her sprawling to the sand. "No more talk," he barked, as Kyle roared in agony, feeling her pain as if it were his own. A searing flash across his skull that momentarily blinded him. Acting on instinct rather than thought, Kyle attacked with a strength he didn't know he possessed, leaping at Vex with inhuman speed. He managed to land a solid blow before the other Marauders reacted, throwing their leader back several steps. But there were too many of them. 3 Marauders tackled Kyle, pinning him to the ground, while a 4th trained a weapon on Lanira, who was struggling to her feet, blood trickling from a cut on her temple. Vex recovered quickly, rage contorting his scared features. He raised his crossbow and fired without hesitation. The metal bolt tore through the air and lodged in Kyle's shoulder, sending waves of agony through his body. Despite her own pain and the weapon trained on her, Lanira reacted with the lightning reflexes of her species. She grabbed a spear from one of the distracted Marauders, and in a fluid motion that spoke of combat training beyond that of a mere cargo pilot, stabbed Vex in the leg. The leader howled in pain, reflexively firing another bolt that went wide, burying itself in the sand. The momentary chaos was the opening they needed. "Run!" Lanira shouted, already darting between 2 surprised Marauders. Kyle struggled to his feet, the bolt still protruding from his shoulder. With a grunt of pain, he pulled it free, causing a fresh gout of blood to flow down his chest. But there was no time for caution. He sprinted after Lanira, his new physiology allowing him to move faster than he would have thought possible despite his injury.